And hello, everybody. I'm BJ. I'm the genealogy specialist at the Maine State. It's been a long week. Genealogy specialist at the Maine State Library. And tonight I'm going to do the second part of my using DNA for genealogy presentation. I'm going to do about a minute and a half of sort of review of what you need to know for today's part to make sense. And then I'm going to dive into the meat of what your results are for those of us who are genealogists and aren't just doing the, oh, it would be neat to see what ethnicity estimate I get. So basically, there are three kinds of DNA testing. One is your straight father's line. One is your straight mother's line. And I'm not going to talk about those tonight. If you go back 5 generations, they're only testing 1 out of 64 or 128 ancestors at that level. So they're really not picking up a lot of your DNA. They can tell you interesting things, they just can't do much for helping with our genealogical tangles that we get. Autosomal DNA looks at the 22 chromosomes you have that are not your X and Y. And so the big thing to remember is the more DNA you share with somebody, the more closely related you are. That's the big scientific truth you need to know. The most you're going to, with the way the tests are done, the most you're going to share with somebody is something like 3,600 approximately centimorgans. And that's for parent and child sharing DNA. And so that tells you that, and going down to as few as 10 centimorgans may be able to help you solve a puzzle in conjunction with everybody else. Because that would not just be you and one other person, that would be you comparing several people to figure out that that was a valid match. Most people recommend ignoring matches under about 7 centimorgans. And all a centimorgan is, it's the unit of measurement. Don't worry about what it means. I'm not sure I could quite explain what it means. But basically, when we're dealing with autosomal DNA, they measure the DNA in units called centimorgans. And if you have multiple centimorgans at the same place on a piece of DNA, it's called a segment. And that'll be more clear when we go through some of this tonight. Okay, so let's take a look. Let me start sharing my screen so I can do the PowerPoint. And I'm also going to stop my video so you do not get the side of my head looking at my screen that's off to the side. Do you guys have my PowerPoint up now? Good. That's what we should have. So I'm glad to see that, unlike earlier today at a couple points, the technology is working. So let's go to the slideshow and start from here. Whoops, that's not what I wanted. I hit the wrong one. That's all of last week's presentation. Here's this week's. Well, when the computer doesn't mess up, the human does, right? So anyhow, this is part 2. Part 1 is at YouTube, so if you missed it and are puzzled, you can go back and watch it. So this is what you get. This is actually my brother, because he very nicely spit in a tube when I asked him to, and I paid for it, so he was happy with doing it for me. And you get 3 things here. You get your DNA story, and that's the ethnicity, and we talked about that last week. I'm not going to talk about through lines other than to say what that is, because it takes a lot more interaction to figure out what is worthwhile there. That's Ancestry's attempt to compare the DNA you have with what's in your tree, mush them together and see if it can predict any other ancestors for you. And it's still a theoretical it's still a work in progress, let's put it that way. This middle column is what you're going to want to work with the most. This is the meat of why it, other people do the DNA for the ethnicity, but as I said, these matches are the bulk of what we as genealogists are going to look at. So here is the first set of my brother's matches. I have purpled out last names for privacy, just so you know that. The first person listed here is Joan J. That's my Aunt Joni. She also tested when I paid for and had a test sent to her. And so I am very thankful for my brother and my aunt because they have made doing a lot of this possible. And the reason I had her tested is my brother and I basically share DNA from both parents. And if somebody matches both my brother and me, I can't tell whether they're from my mother's side of the family or my father's. But my dad and both my parents are deceased, so I can't say, hey, can you test for me? However, my dad's youngest sister is still alive, and so she very nicely tested for me, which means that basically anyone who matches my brother and my aunt is going to be a match on my dad's side of the family, because my brother and aunt are closely related enough that anyone who matches both of them is going to match. There's some cases where people will match one or the other at very small levels of DNA, but for the amounts we're looking at, people are going to match both of them. It shows there's a common ancestor in our trees. This happens to be the exact same tree that's at my brother's, because I manage both of them. Kathy is my Aunt Joni's daughter, and she tested on her own. And so as you can see, she has not talked to me to ask me for access to my tree to add on to hers, because mine's public, she doesn't need to do that. You'll see here, my aunt and my brother share 1,700 centimorgans across 48 segments or chunks. So if you're kind of confused by this, think about a centimorgan as being an egg, and you divide them into dozens of eggs. And so this is the same sort of thing, as we've got 1,700 of these chunked into 48 clumps with my aunt. Whereas with my cousin, because it's another generation removed, my brother and my cousin only share 833 centimorgans, approximately half of what my brother shares with her mother. The segments didn't go down as much. They can vary much more. They're finding, as they do all of this practical research, and it doesn't make much difference from most of what I'm going to talk tonight about, but it does help. It does sometimes back up more with endogamy from what I've heard. There do seem to be some segments that seem to be kind of sticky. And again, think about the difference between plain white rice and sticky rice. And if you drop plain white rice, it's going to go all over. The sticky rice, you get some clumps in. And some of the DNA seems to be working that same way. But again, some of this is, they've had the theory for a while, and that we're only now getting to have tens of thousands of samples to check whether the theory works. And endogamy in particular, where you have people who for generations and centuries married within a small group of people. So French Canadians, who are all descended from about 10,000 original ancestors who immigrated to New France in the 1600s, Ashkenazi Jews, some Amish and Mennonite groups, some island populations in the Pacific or in the Caribbean. You had a very limited number of potential marriage partners. So you're going to get it's called pedigree collapse on the paper trail side, where you start getting second cousins marrying, and so you have great grandparents in multiple places on your tree. And so that's going to show up not only in the paper trail, but in the DNA trail. And so if you have one of those ethnic groups, it can add a little complication. So anyway, here we have, and this is matching with my brother again, this woman, Anne, she does not, when I go into Aunt Joni's result, she does not match Aunt Joni. So I know she has to be on my mother's side of the family. Because I'm fortunate, my mother's family is all from New England, my father's family is all from Scotland and Ireland, and there's no overlap in what I consider genealogical time. In other words, the last 500 years or so. You're not getting anything where you're going to get overlap on the DNA. Now, I happen to know who Robert is, and Anne is related to him. So I know that Robert is on my mother's father's side of the family. And so one of the things they let you do here at Ancestry, see these little colored dots here? Those are defined by the user. Those are not defined by Ancestry. They've got 24 colors, and you can choose what color to make those. And you do that by clicking on this add or edit groups. So I gave both of these people, because I know how they're related to me, that they're on this is my mother's first cousin and her and Anne's son. So I put the yellow on for that side of the family, from my mother's father's side. I have no idea who Judy is. But when I go into my shared matches that I'll show you in a little bit, she also matches Anne and Robert. So I know she has to be on that side of the family. And so I can confidently put that yellow button there. Now, this is close enough that I can tell when you get down to 5th, 6th cousins and you don't necessarily have a complete tree, you need to be really careful that you have found all the relationships. But if you only have 75% of your ancestors back 6 generations, and they've only got 75% of their ancestors, there's a chunk there that you could be missing.
BJ?
Yeah.
I've got a quick question. I just missed it. You said that Judy is related to Robert and Anne.
Right.
How did you determine that?
I'll show you in a minute.
Okay.
That's through looking at the shared matches, which is where we're going. So I can look at who matches both Robert and me. I can't look at Robert's view of the matches, but I can see everyone who matches me and Robert, or my brother, or who matches my brother and my Aunt Joni. And I can tell Anne is a close enough cousin that if she were on my dad's side of the family, she would have to match my Aunt Joni. Because she's that close, looking at this amount of DNA, she's no more distant than a second cousin once removed from me. I happen to know she's my first cousin once removed. And so that's how I know. Now down here, I know how Lee is related to me. He's a second cousin once removed. Ancestry predicts 3rd to 4th cousin. And so and because I know on paper who he is, I can assign him to my father's side of the family. And I can look at other matches, and I have some others. So I've used light purple for that. And for the further back generations where I don't know the exact relationship, the light purples, I know the relationship and I know what part of my father's tree it is. The dark purple, I don't know exactly who this person is, but I know it's the same part of the tree that the light purple is. So this Connie is related to me on my father's side of the family. Again, I'm able to tell that because she matches my cousin Lee, she matches my Aunt Joni, she matches my cousin Kathy, who are all on my dad's side of the family, and she doesn't match any of these three. Does that make sense? You're basically sorting your relatives, and you start with the people where you know who they are, which is why having either a parent or a parent sibling test, if you can, is the best thing to do after you test yourself, in my opinion. If you can't get that, if that generation's all gone, getting one first cousin, full first cousin, sharing 2 grandparents with you from each side of the family. And if you're really lucky and get 2 from each side of the family, you're in even better shape. Just because this is a case where more data lets you make, and because of the way things, my cousin Kathy, as you can see, has a lot of DNA, including probably some from her mother, that my dad didn't, her mother inherited some from my grandparents that my dad didn't get. So I can't have that DNA because my dad didn't get it. But my cousin Kathy may have gotten it. Yeah, I don't know why you can't see, someone said they can't see my screen. Can everybody see my screen, the ancestry data? Okay, so you may want to go back in and out if you can't see the screen, or refresh. I don't know why. I'm sorry, but I don't know why. Okay, so let's look at the next. So here's my brother compared to Robert. And because I've put in a fairly detailed tree and Robert's put in a fairly detailed tree, Ancestry is able to compare the trees and say, hey, you both have this couple. And that is indeed our most common recent ancestor match. Now we have some others, and one thing you want to be careful of, especially those of you who are working in, say, New England, where you aren't quite up to the endogamy stage, but you certainly have some surnames that are fairly common. Both my grandmother and Robert's grandmother had the maiden surname Poor, which, for northeastern Massachusetts is a relatively common, it's an old New England name. And it turns out we are something like 5th or 6th cousins through the Poors. But if this weren't here for some reason, if this was an unknown paternity situation or an adoption, or he hadn't completed his tree, it would be way too easy to think this is where the close connection was. And that's why you want to think about tree completeness. Because if you've only investigated this line and this line, you've got a chunk here in the middle that can be a problem. Or if you can't find your great-grandmother's parents, this may be where the connection is, not here on the Poor line. Does that make sense to everybody? So he's got this number of people in his tree. If the trees show a common ancestor, it will be here. And you can click on here and add a note. So, if you've contacted him, you can add that. If you've contacted the person and there's no response, you can put that in the note. If you have ideas about where the connection is, but you don't want to put it somewhere other people can see, only you can see the notes. So, if you want to wrote to him and this doesn't happen to be true in this case, wrote to somebody and they were rude in return, don't contact again, they won't see that note. No one will see that but you. On the other hand, I've had, on some of them, I've put in a no shared, no common ancestors, but I think it's through this line on their tree because it's the only line that's in the right geographic place at that time to have an intersection. Because until 40 years ago, parents had to be in the same room for a child to result. And so you're not getting, if I've looked at cases where all of these people but 2 were born in Germany, and I have no German ancestry. And so I know it has to be the couple born in Ireland is where the connection is. but I have no clue whether it's on my paternal grandfather or grandmother's side, and I have no connection where it is. I can put that in the note saying, likely couple, that's the connection is these people, because they were in Scotland when all of the other people at that great-great-grandparents line were in Germany, so that I remember why I've eliminated the others and don't have to go back over it. So the next thing, why is this not moving? Oh, I know. It does show you the relationship. It breaks it down. So this shows how we're related, and we're second cousins, which is a very nice thing to see, because that's what the paper trail says. I've adapted this from Blaine Bettinger's book. There has not been a single proven case of people who are closer, second cousins or closer, who don't match. So in addition to looking at who you do match, you want to look at who you don't match, because if you're expecting someone to show up as a second cousin or closer and they're not there, there's a problem. There's an adoption, there's a misattributed paternity, something like that. And even at the third cousin range, you're looking at 90+% possibility for somebody showing up. So I pretty much say out to third cousins, if you don't see the person, you want to look closer. And this is a case where absence of evidence or absence of their presence here in the shared matches, if they're third cousin or closer, is significant. Does that make sense to everybody? That, when you're that close, you are going to share DNA. However, if you find a fifth cousin and you test, look how quickly these numbers go down after third cousin. This is because, last week when we talked about how the DNA mixes and matches with each generation. So in this case, you're not only looking from you back to your ancestor, and remember we talked about how you can have it mix and match so you don't get anything from one particular grandparent. You're also then going down to the other person and having that same process happen. So if you think about it, my aunt and I are actually 3 steps from our common ancestors. 2 back from me to my father, and my father to my grandparents, and my aunt from her back. So that's 3 steps difference. My cousin Kathy were 4 steps. And every time you introduce another step, that means the DNA has recombined more, and the chances of you sharing something has gone down. So again, if you look at this, if you find someone on paper who's a 4th cousin or further out, and you turn out not to match, don't panic. Check and see whether you're more the second cousins who are in between match, just to be on the safe side with, but just so you know, this is a really hard concept for people to get, which is why I put it in here. And if you've got Blaine Bettinger's book, which I highly recommend, if you're interested in this topic, it's worth the $20 or so at Amazon to get it. And make sure you get the 2019 revised edition, because the previous book had come out in 2016, and in 2.5 years, things had changed enough that it's worth buying the second edition new for the extra money, not the earlier edition used, where everybody's getting rid of it because they bought the second edition. And I say that one as some, oh yeah, Mary has it. It's a great book. He's easy to understand. He knows what he's talking about. I listen to him whenever I could see a webinar with him. I don't care if it's Intro to DNA. I listen to it because I learn something every time. Partly because he's really on top. This is part of my job. The DNA stuff is his whole job now. He's a lawyer by training, but he's become, his career is now the genetic genealogy education. So he keeps up on top of things, and I rely on that sometimes. So here's a look. This is actually at 23andMe. One of the things that Ancestry does not offer is what's called a chromosome browser. And what we have here is, here are our 23 chromosomes. If you remember, I said last week from 1 through 22, they were really creative, and 1 is the biggest, down through 22 being the shortest. And then X is the one you get from your, for women, you get some of it from your mother and some from your father. For men, you just get it from your mother, and you get the Y from your father. Now, I happen to know who this is. This is my first cousin. My father and her mother were siblings. What it's showing is, and this is simplifying it because this is all you need to know for starting to do this analysis, is that wherever there's purple in these, she and I share DNA. And this is where, if you didn't understand the segments, here's where it comes in. We share 1,026 centimorgans, and I think it's like 27 segments. I counted these at one point. And so you see how there are these chunks that are, so you know, some of them are tiny little segments, and then here we share most of chromosome 10. Does that make sense to everybody? Now on the segment, if you didn't understand the segments earlier, you get it now. So, you know, like, this is my couple dozen eggs I share with her, and here's the half a dozen that were the special duck eggs or whatever. There's a half dozen. They do not make it easy to get to the chat when you're speaking, by the way. So then if we look, this woman is my second cousin. Notice how much less DNA we share. That's a pretty significant drop from first cousin to second cousin. So can you see how when you get out past third cousin, you're going to get some people that you're related to that you don't match? Because these chunks of will come back. We could be half first cousins once removed, and I'm going to show you a chart to figure out the ranges in a bit. So Ancestry does not have that chromosome browser. They're pretty committed to not doing one, but you can import to MyHeritage and 23andMe for free or very little that have them. Sorry, MyHeritage and Family Tree DNA. 23andMe, you also have to test at, but they give you this tool. So here's a list of my matches at 23andMe. I know who this person, this person, this person, this person, and this person are. I don't know who this second Scott is. I don't know who Susan is, and I'm not going to worry about these people. But I like being able to connect to anyone who's close. I like to know by the paper trail anyone closer than third cousin. I figure I should be able to figure that out. So I go through, and this Scott, I can tell he matches Ginny and Rosalind. So he's got to be on my dad's side of the family, which is why I know where they connect. I put the lighter blue because I know it's that side of the family, but I don't know the relationship. Got that? Robert, I used yellow here. He's the same Robert who was in the earlier, like me, he's tested at more than one service. So here he is. This is the Scott I don't know, but I know he's paternal. And then I know this Scott and Amy are on my mother's side of the family because I know who they are. Well, actually, I know who Amy is, and I've been able to make some pretty good guesses as to who Scott is. But what's interesting is if I look at Susan, she matches Scott, me, and Amy, which means that this Susan is almost certainly going to get a green line. Does that make sense, how I'm doing this? You used to have to do this manually. There is now a tool called Auto Cluster that if I have time, I'll show you. If not, I'm going to, in a couple weeks, do one of these sessions on third-party tools to do them in more depth. And Auto Cluster is great. I used to have to stand on my bed for the big piece of wall behind it because I needed a place to put all the Post-it notes as I was sorting these people. And now I can give Genetic Affairs, which developed Auto Cluster, access to my ancestry data and hit a button, and 20 minutes to half an hour later, it comes in a nice colored spreadsheet. It's wonderful. So that's how, so I can now predict that Susan's going to get a green arrow. And I probably wouldn't put it there. And this is again where the case where the notes are good until I have something confirming it. But I would put it in the notes of how I worked it out if I also had her at Ancestry. This is Family Tree DNA's autosomal record or matches. I have not done as much with this because the closest I've come, I'm pretty sure he's on my mother's father's side of the family based on the shared surnames. But I have no clue who any of these people are. And I don't have anyone here close enough, an aunt or a first cousin, to do the shared matching with. Because I'm guessing these two are actually closer to fourth, these three are all closer to fourth cousins, based on these numbers and the fact that I don't know who they are. Because certainly on my dad's side of the family and on my mother's side of the family, if their second cousins are closer, I either know who they are, or on my dad's side of the family, Aunt Joni knows who everybody is. So that's telling me they're either further out, there's an adoption or something in the line, or something like that. And so I have not played around with the stuff at Family Tree DNA because I don't have that way to anchor matches to either side of the tree for me. And so it's a lot harder to do this. So anyway, Blaine Bettinger's developed what he's called the Shared Centimorgan Project. And I'm going to show you version 4.0. This is 3.0. It updated a couple months ago. I was actually one of the beta readers for it before it went live. As he gets more data, he's now got this where people have sent in the paper trail distance and the number of centimorgans they share. So said, I share this many centimorgans with a person who's my third cousin by the paper trail. He's got that data for 50,000 relationships. And so what he's doing is, and I'm going to flip live to the actual website to show you this. He's got the relationship, and this side of the page is the full relationships, and this side is the half relationships. So where you get, a half first cousin shares one grandparent, not two, because your parents that you are in common are half siblings. So that the half relationships share half of the expected common ancestor couple with you. So he's got the relationship, and then he has the average number of centimorgans for that relationship, and then he has the range. that people are actually finding. And again, this is because of that mix and match and how, yes, I got 50% from my father of the DNA, but of the DNA I got from him, it may be more from his mother's side than his father's side because it's mixed up in him. So, and what you can do is you can put in the number of shared centimorgans, or at 23andMe, they give you the percentage. And then you'll notice this was the blank chart. Well, this was for 206, sorry. And you see how that's a fairly wide ring. And when I narrow it down to the 1,711 that my brother and aunt share, it's closer and there are many fewer relationships that it could be. But that number of centimorgans could be aunt and uncle, like it is for my brother and aunt. It could have been a half sibling, could be a niece or nephew. Or it could be grandparent, grandchild. But again, I happen to know what it is, so I was able to submit that to be evidence. So before I go any further, I'm going to stop sharing this screen and let me share my actual browser screen. So here it is. If you just Google Shared Centimorgan Project, it will come up. I think this is also in the handout I gave out last week. As I said, you can put in any number here. So let's say it says you share 778 centimorgans with somebody. There's a pretty good chance this is going to be one of the relationships. 90% of the relationships in his database, and working with the DNA geek guy, 90% of those relationships are one of these, and you get a few strays who are these others. And here you have that nice graphic representation of the possible, and here you can see, so it's great grandparent, average is 887. The reality that people are finding is a range from 485 to 1,486. And so sometimes, if you have a case where you and two siblings have tested, and one of you shares 7 centimorgans with somebody, and one shares 35 and one shares 87, you can actually look and do the highest and the lowest, and sometimes you can narrow it down pretty clearly, because if you've got someone who's not 0, you're going to eliminate some of these out here. But if you've got somebody who's 85, you're going to eliminate, the not 0 is going to eliminate these closer ones. But if you've got somebody who's up at 87, you're going to eliminate a bunch of these outer ones as well. You can't do that here yet with the 2. You have to kind of do one of the 2 relationships and then print it out and cross out the others. But you can do it manually. But this is, if you're doing work with your DNA, this DNA Painter Tools Shared Centimorgan version 4 should be right up there in your and as I said, Googling Shared Centimorgan Project will get you to this page. And so this is one of these things, if you want to work with your DNA, bookmark this page, because it will be your best friend. Because you'll notice that, if I put in that 1,711 that my brother and aunt share, it says there's, this slight but basically never happens possibility that it could be a sibling, and it's going to be one of these relationships. Whereas Ancestry just said close family, and that doesn't spell out, because close family to me would include a sibling or a parent, but this is saying no, it can't be one of those. Does that make sense to everybody? And some of these, I will tell you that it'll be really sort of fuzzy for you until you play with it, which is kind of one reason I'm glad I'm doing this. I like doing this in person, but I also like doing it this way so that you're sort of following along on your own computer and can, pull these up and bookmark them right now if you want, in a way that people aren't able to do when they're sitting in a sort of stuffy room at the state library. So I'm going to stop sharing that and go back to my PowerPoint. So that's the shared Centimorgan project, which is an absolutely brilliant bit of information that Blaine Bettingen, between writing that book and doing this shared Centimorgan project, he is the genetic genealogist's best friend. Okay. So you can also compare multiple people. And so this is me compared to Amy, Scott, and Robert. And it's looking at anywhere I shared DNA with Robert is in yellow, with Scott is in orange, and with Amy is in purple. And so what you can see is there are places where Scott, Amy, and I all match at the same spot. And so I can be pretty confident that we got that segment of DNA from one half of the couple that is our most recent shared ancestors, which is our great-grandparents. And so that DNA in my DNA has to come from one of those great-grandparents. I don't know whether it was Grammy or Grampy Poor, but I know it's one of them because that's how I can share. I'm back to my PowerPoint. I'm not on a site. This is from 23andMe. The screen capture is 23andMe. Because you can do this everywhere but Ancestry, but I find 23andMe's to be the prettiest. And so it's the one I used and it's the clearest to see. And I screen capped a bunch of the sites and decided to use this because it showed up the best on the PowerPoint, especially for you guys sitting at home. Okay, so what have we got next? Here's me compared to my first cousin, Ginny. And you can see that, this is Ginny's niece, Rosalind, my first cousin once removed, her niece. And so you notice that she shares a whole lot more purple with her Aunt Ginny than she shares with me, her mother's first cousin. So I'm her first cousin once removed. So this is comparing three of us, Ginny, me, and Rosalind. But again, I can say this chunk here that all three of us share had to have come from one of Ginny or my grandparents or one of Rose's great-grandparents, those two people. That DNA comes from one of those two people. I can't tell for certain because it could be from either one of them, but that's where it is. And there is a DNA painter, which I'm not going to get time to talk to today. But I'll include in the third-party tools. You can actually take this information and start painting it onto ancestors so that you can begin to then say, if I find somebody where the only place we match is in this segment right here, I know they need to be related to me through my father's parents, because that's where Ginny and I got that DNA. And so it can't have come from my mother's parents because I've already got it from my father's parents. Does that make sense to everybody? So let's take a look. Now this is looking at me. Again, this is compared to Rose, Ginny's nephew, or niece, sorry. Me is the first cousin once removed, and Scott is a second cousin. And so on this one, I can now say he's only on my paternal grandfather's side of the family. He's descended from my grandfather Jameson's brother. So I can look here and now say this segment I was looking at on the previous screen that I didn't know whether it came from my grandmother or my grandfather, I can now say, bingo, that came from my grandfather. That piece of DNA. Because that's the only way the four of us can share that, we're descended from. Now, I can't tell whether it's my paternal grandfather's mother or father, but I know it's my paternal grandfather. By looking this relationship out from the core of me, I can then start doing this working back a generation at a time. And it's data intensive, but if you're like me and have a great grandmother whose birth certificate says illegitimate, where her father's name should be. This is a pretty important technique to be able to figure out which matches I need to be able to say come from my grandmother's father's side of the family. And I've been working on this for 2 years. Now, I've been doing a lot of other things around the 2 years, so I'm only spending an hour or two on this a week, and I'm at some point planning to take a vacation day and just do this all day and correlate all this information, because right now I do it infrequently enough. I spend the first third of my dedicated time to this figuring out where I left off. But this is the sort of thing you can tell by the shared matches. Does this make sense to everybody why this is important? Good. Okay. So last week, you'll remember I started with this mystery man, and that, Y-DNA showed that his last name was going to be something like Nicholas or Nicholson. And he turned out, with autosomal DNA testing, to be a man named Robert Ivan Nichols. And the way they were able to do this was that slow, painstaking, taking his DNA, uploading it, looking at the chromosome browser, working through the matches, figuring where those matches tied in with his other matches, and going on from there. Does that make sense to everybody, how they did this now? This is also how they caught the original Night Stalker, East Area Rapist, various other nicknames guy in California a couple years ago, which leads into my final bit of topic here. Well, first let me talk about the third-party tools. I mentioned the genetic affairs auto-clustering and the DNA painter. There's also GEDmatch, and that's going to come up in a minute when I talk about some of the philosophical stuff. It lets you, if you've tested at Ancestry and your cousins tested at 23andMe, you can both upload your data and compare it at GEDmatch. And it has a chromosome browser, so if you and your cousin have both tested at Ancestry and you want to start doing some of this, picking out the relationships and what DNA you inherited from what person, you can both upload to GEDmatch and do it there. And so that's the workaround for Ancestry not having a chromosome browser. So finally, I'm going back to this slide. We talked about confirming a paper trail. Can you now see how you can use this to confirm the paper trail? If you have, I know I said last week you can really only go back 5 to 6 generations with the actual DNA, but you can do some if you've got enough data and enough time and patience. You can sometimes get back far enough to, they're getting back almost to Revolutionary War soldiers with some of this, of comparing trees and figuring out some of those late 1700s, early 1800s mysteries in places like Kentucky and Maine where there weren't good records. But I said what I did last week because I didn't want to get your hopes up, okay, about the 5 to 7 generations. Doing this for beyond the 5 to 7 generations takes a lot of work. It's possible but you need to test the right people, and it takes a lot of work. You can see why adoptees are doing this, to figure out their family. Same thing if somebody has discovered either through a DNA test or other means that their father's not who they thought it was, this can help with that. Now, law enforcement purposes, there are two issues here. One is identifying Jane and John Does, or unknown victims of a crime, and the other is identifying people who've committed crimes. And so I'm going to stop sharing my screen because I think you can remember both of those two things, and start sharing my video again. And I'm just going to talk very briefly. To me, these are actually two different things. And so some of this, what I'm going to say in the next 5 minutes, is my personal opinion, but I think it's a relatively educated opinion. To me, there's a fundamental difference between identifying the unknown victims and identifying the offenders in terms of how our genealogical data is being used. The identifying unknown victims, I have very little trouble with law enforcement doing. I think philosophically, for me, philosophically and morally, that's a good thing to give a person their name back. I have a lot more trouble with the identifying offenders. Right now, it can be done without a warrant. And to me, and again, this is my personal opinion, doing this kind of work, really, I don't see why it doesn't require a warrant, the same way searching someone's house does. And, 2 and 3 years ago, when they were first starting to do this, with the first couple big cases, it was taking hundreds of, if not thousands of hours to do this work. So they weren't going to do it for anybody who wasn't a serial killer or serial rapist. Now with the auto clustering and other tools, you get cases where you may, even if there's no one closer than a third cousin, it may only be a couple weeks of work for a genetic genealogist to do this now. And to me, again, it's going back to, when they were only doing it for somebody who'd killed 30 people, that's a different story. What if they, if it's easy enough now, are they going to do it for somebody who robbed 3 stores and happened to leave some DNA behind? And some officer's going to do this without much oversight on his own, or, with a few hours from his department. So you can see why I have some qualms about that. GEDmatch is the easiest source for law enforcement to use. You can opt out of, in fact, it's an opt-in system. When you upload to GEDmatch, they are putting you as not being accessible to law enforcement, and you have to change that to be accessible. They don't break down these two different things. So once you're accessible to law enforcement, it's both. And I really, and I've written to them, I really wish they would split that out, because I think from my talking to people doing these presentations, a lot more of us are comfortable with identifying the Jane and John Does than with the identifying offenders. The other issue for me is a lot of people had uploaded before this became a possibility. And so the first few of these were done before people knew that it was being done. And there was no way to opt out. So my answer to you, I have people say to me, I really want to get a cousin tested, but they're worried about privacy. So if that's the case, the 2 places where you have to send in a spit test, so law enforcement's not able to use them because you are not able to just upload data instead of going through their lab, are Ancestry and 23andMe. And 23andMe will anonymize your data and aggregate it and share it with, say, pharmaceutical companies, but it's anonymized and aggregated. 23andMe, their model is privacy. You see your matches, but you can use a name that's not connected to you as your username. so people can't figure out who you are, which is like that woman that has the Judy and a series of numbers. I have no clue who she is, because just by going with the name Judy. Now, obviously, if I'm working in my tree and I see a woman of about the right relationship named Judy, I'm going to go, I wonder if that's her. But at the same time, if somebody really wants privacy, Ancestry is the way to go. 23andMe is almost as good. Now, Ancestry does not have the Chromosome Browser. It does have the shared matches, but it doesn't have the Chromosome Browser. And you can then ask if you can upload a GEDmatch and opt out and stay opted out of the law enforcement. But if somebody's really concerned about privacy, I wouldn't ask them that. I would probably actually upload it to Family Tree DNA, who have had a few cases where law enforcement snuck in with data, but they have also, I know, in some cases resisted law enforcement fishing expeditions without a warrant. So that's, if someone's worried about privacy, but you want the Chromosome Browser, uploading to MyHeritage or Family Tree DNA is going to be your better bet than GEDmatch for the most part. But if you want that data, if you want those shared matches, but you don't want, but somebody's really worried about privacy, go with Ancestry, because you'll be able to do some work from that with the shared matches. And Ancestry is really committed to not sharing with any, their model is genealogical data. They don't have to make money from anything else. They're making plenty of money off of many of us with our $20 or $35 a month subscription. And so they don't have to please law enforcement. And they have, from my understanding, is they have resisted even warrants and gone, in at least one case, went to court to say, this is too much of a fishing expedition. You need to narrow down what you're asking for. So, I'm glad when they're catching the people who killed 30, the serial killers who've killed 30 people. But at the same time, the current estimate is that for those of us who are white North Americans, somewhere between 50 and 60% of us can already be identified by what's in these databases. Because even if you haven't tested yet, if the right combination of second, third, and fourth cousins have, they can find you. 50-50 chance. If you're non-white, or you're not, your ancestors, your family is in Europe and you're the only one who lives here, the results go down. And there are parts of Africa and Asia where it's almost no chance. But I've seen cases where a journalist had, 5 coworkers anonymously spit, and they were able to figure out, who 3 of the 5 were, type thing. And they wrote a newspaper article. So yeah, there are some concerns. And I mean, we see this with a lot of things. We see it with internet stuff. We saw it with cable TV. We see it with all other sorts of areas of law enforcement where the technology gets ahead of the law. The technology is a lot faster at developing than new laws can be written. And that's what we're in, that flux stage. The handout, let me see if I can find it to put it in the chat again. It's been that kind of week, so I'm not promising that I can find it, okay? I'm working with our web person at the state library to get a place where I can put all the handouts online. So if you miss one, here we go. You should see a file up in the chat box called Genetic Genealogy Resources. And if you open that, there's some podcasts, which I'm going to talk about in Machine Magic Monday in a couple of weeks. So if you've never done a podcast, don't worry, that's coming. It's essentially radio on demand, okay? It's a wonderful thing. A couple of those podcasts, and let me open this so I can talk not from memory because I haven't looked at this in like a month. So, so anyway, looking at this, the International Society of Genetic Genealogy has a wiki. They've also got a glossary. So if you start reading about this stuff and don't know what something is, there's the glossary. Genetic Genealogy Ireland is a conference that's, you know, obviously focused on Ireland, but they have some other non-Ireland, you know, how to get started, introduction stuff. Or once you've played around with this and you want to go up to the advanced beginner intermediate stuff, that's a really good place to go. A Center for Health Law, Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics at Harvard did a conference on the consumer genetics and the ethical and legal considerations. And those sessions are online at the link that's in the handout, especially panel 5, which is about the using the family identification. Okay. I listed the tools I've talked about: GEDmatch, the Shared Centimorgan project, DNA Painter, which is the chromosome mapping, and the Otter Cluster tool from Genetic Affairs, which is also now, if you have DNA at MyHeritage, there's a basic version of that that's part of MyHeritage. And then there are blogs. I highly recommend the genetic genealogist, Blaine Bettinger, obviously. The legal genealogist, Judy Russell, tends to write about DNA in her Sunday posts. And most of my thoughts on things like the law enforcement comes from reading and listening to these two people. They're both lawyers, they're both serious genealogists, and I think that they've proven to me over the years of being worth listening to. DNA Explained is by Roberta Estes, and she does a really good job of talking about how she's used her DNA results to interact with the paper trail, to interact with known family relationships and places like newspapers to get stories. So she's a really good storyteller and a really good genetic genealogist in one. I included Israel Pickholtz because he's got some great stories, and he's Jewish, so he's dealing with a very endogamous population. I have not found a similar blog for French Canadian genealogy, but if you have heavy French Canadian ancestry, you may get some good data out of reading Israel Pickholtz's blog, because he's trying to track all the Pickholtzes and dealing with the marrying second and third cousins for generations. The company blogs to see what's going on, some books. These are basically, to my mind, these are there are a bunch of others that have come out over the last 20 years. If it's more than, and I actually noticed I haven't updated to the second edition. I'm sorry, Genetic Genealogy and Practice has not been updated. I have updated that one. And this came out, this has more of a British Isles focus, the one from Pen and Sword. But again, it has very good basic information, some good case studies. There is a new book that's come out, I should add to this, that's advanced, it's called Advanced Genetic Genealogy. And then I list here at some podcasts. This Bear Brook is a fascinating, these first two are true crime. Bear Brook is a fascinating case. 5 years apart, 2 barrels were found in the Bear Brook State Park in New Hampshire, over near, I think it's near Concord, Manchester, with 4 corpses, 1 woman and 3 young girls. And they had no idea who they were. They couldn't figure it out. At the same time, in California, there was a young girl abandoned by her supposed father. The supposed father later gets arrested for a murder. And around the same time, this girl who was abandoned did a DNA test to see if she could figure out who her mother was, because she had this, turns out this guy was not her father. But his DNA connected to one of the bodies in the barrel in New Hampshire. So you've got this, you know, and they could prove he was in Texas for a while. So you've got this literally across the country, and they ended up doing, I think, 7 episodes about this crime because it's that detailed and it moves around. But it's especially episode 6 where they talk about using the DNA, and they talk to a law professor about some of the issues around it. And the 4th season of Criminology looks at, it's like 6 episodes looking at 6 of these cases where they've used DNA to identify somebody. So if you don't mind true crime, or you're interested enough in this that you're willing to listen to the true crime, those are both really worth it. Bear Brook in particular was incredibly well done as podcasts go. You know, it's New Hampshire Public Radio. It's not just some guy sitting in his basement doing it. Although Criminology is literally done by a guy sitting in his basement studio with a friend. But again, they're pretty good, and they talk through a lot of these, you know, it's in chunks here and there through the whole season, but they do talk about a lot of how it's used, and some of the legal and moral concerns, ethical concerns around it. So I know that there's a lot more to this I could say, but my goal over this was to give you the tools that if you've done a test at either Ancestry or 23andMe in particular, since those were I used most of the examples from, that you have an idea now of how to start tinkering with the data that this has given you. And as I said, I'm working with our website manager to put all of this up on the website, as well as the presentation at YouTube. Because more than anything else, I think this presentation is one where being able to look at the slides again, I think would be helpful, rather than having to go, where you can flip through the slides rather than having to scan through the 2 hours of video to find what you're interested in. Does that make sense to everybody? So, you know, I don't know when that's going to happen. I hope it's in the next couple of weeks. But again, if you get into this and you get bogged down and want the slides, email me. And I'm trying to be quick about those ones which is, you know, can you send me one thing, one link or one file? I'm trying to get to those within a couple days, but no guarantee. I can't tell you how much email I've been getting the last 3 or 4 weeks. I think everybody is stir crazy and doing genealogy and getting stuck and asking me questions. So I am going to now stop the recording.